So,
Hmm.
so I saw you guys pick your books up and you've got Post-its all over them. So we got a Post-it check for everybody, okay?
I'm not that good.
Knowles are very neat. I'm just like really impressed with his. They're all the same color. They're all in the same line.
Oh, wow.
Those are just the bookmarks of like where I need to get to.
Oh, is that what that is? Okay. Yeah, I end up having to go through my book, the ebook, and then sometimes even dig out the audio because I find myself, well, I wouldn't take a panoramic shot of my office to show you all the notes that we share on everything, but
There's an audio book of this?
there is, yes.
Is it any
How are
good?
you reading it?
It's, you know, you can listen to it, but it's when it's a male voice reading it, and whenever it comes to a footnote, a female voice comes in and says, read footnote or endnote, and then there's a PDF file that's attached with the audio.
Oh, no.
Endnotes. And
No, that's why I couldn't figure out how you would read such a thing. Even if it existed, I didn't know I wanted to listen to it.
yeah, well, I mean, there
I
are parts
usually have the book in front of me if I'm listening to the audio.
Yeah.
So
that's what I do too. Yeah, that and my Oxford English Dictionary. Mr. Wallace has really taken vocabulary to a whole. So
is that why you were saying you would want to talk to him about that piece of the interview as
Yes.
far as he's trying to explain it in simple language?
yes, exactly. I was curious about if he were to explain it I'd like to see his early draft if this,
Simple.
you know, so, but,
Hmm.
well, shall we begin? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
sure.
that seems like a good starting point is the, I don't know what term to use here, the relative, is the novel getting easier to process? Is it more difficult? Do you feel more grounded? Do you have landmarks or reference points you're using? How are you approaching? Because there's been a shift in this narrative. There's no question in my mind that this middle section of the book, it's slower paced, it's much more introspective, and we stay a lot longer with characters and with situations that are occurring. So how has that experience been for you? How have you approached it, and how does it compare to the early reading? Or anything else you'd care to say?
Yeah.
Well, for me, at least with this read through, it feels exactly the same as the first, in the sense that with the more introspective pieces, I'm finding it's harder to find connections and clues to how the story fits together. I felt with the early pages, everything was very disconnected, but there were enough breadcrumbs where you can follow the trails to try to figure out how the story is connected. And because it's gone to a more introspective pace, I'm just finding that I'm dreading sometimes reading the book, just because I know I have to wade through 20 some odd pages of Pemulus doing tennis, or of trying to understand the Enid House dynamic. And so for me, because we're focusing on those characters, I'm not able to comprehend what's actually happening on a macroscopic scale.
So are you suggesting, Noah, that there's that the longer passages have less, another word for it, less essential text?
I'm not for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think Wallace is trying to ruminate on some of these ideas that he's brought up in the first part of the text, and he's trying to let them play out. But the way in which they're playing out, at least for me, is not very satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking for a connection to plot or?
Plot and characters. So Typically, when I'm going through my copy, I'll underline certain passages that really stand out to me, or connections to other characters. So, for example, when we got to the Enid house, there was connections to Don Gately and the concavity and convexity and Mildred Bonk. And so I was underlining those things. But then when we got to more of the tennis matches, I have just blank pages because I'm not able to find very easily a lot of what I found to be meaningful in that depth of that first part of the novel.
How's it
I don't
been?
know how everyone else feels.
How's it been for you, Jessica?
No change since last time, but only because I'm totally swamped with other things.
Oh,
I'm here to
okay.
just listen and kind of chime in when I can about what I've read so far. So
Okay.
I guess I understand part of what Noah's saying about the reader experience is different, because there are moments that I suppose if we're looking for I guess I'm going to say connections, it can feel like a slog. And there are sections where I find myself, okay, how long is this section? So I'll leaf through and see, oh, this one's going to be 15 pages. All right, let's go in, and off I go. But at the same time, once I'm in it, I find myself able more and more to settle into those sections and feel and try to feel out what they're about. Now, for the tennis matches, and all the tennis stuff, once I got, I don't remember when I hit it, some time ago, when I got to the point where Hal and others were so wiped out, and Hal was given his monologue on loneliness and isolation, that just opened up the novel for me, and at some level. And then, like, maybe 3 days later, I read something that Stephen had written or said that basically echoed that same thought. I said, yep, okay, I'm on the right track. And then now I'm able to look at those sections, and I see I'm reading it for a thematic thread or a psychological thread of consistency, rather than one that, well, I'm really interested to find out how this terrorism thing is going to go and what's going to happen with the Quebecois and everything else. I find myself able to settle in a little more, like I say, and listen and feel out psychologically what he's after. What I'm less certain of now is, do we need the mass of this text for that thematic thread? And that's the part I'm starting to question myself, or question now, is that, do I have to read quite so much in order just to accomplish this one task? Which tells me that I must be missing more somewhere.
So my theory on this, and Stephen, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is that it is supposed to be effectual to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
We are supposed to feel isolated from the text and to feel what the characters are feeling with these long stretches of text that we literally have to see, okay, how many more pages do I have before I get a new scene or something else? And I think it's supposed to be effectual for that isolation,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that we are isolated within this text and we are trying to wade through to the next piece.
Mm-hmm. It's I agree with what both of you said. The isolation theme, the separation theme. He spent 225 pages disconnecting everyone from everything.
Mm-hmm.
Before anything really started to happen, other than the entertainment cartridge showing up at the Saudi emissaries or medical attaché's home. Nothing else has really happened if you're looking at plot in that sense, right? So my first experience of this novel, I think I've said before, was 40 false starts, and I get somewhere between 40 and 200 or 300 pages in and just set it aside, not get back to it. And when I finally got through it, the trick for me, and I don't know if it's a trick, but Steve, you said you feel like there must be something more there, was when I found myself in one of those passages that I'm like, oh my gosh, is this ever going to end? I would go back to the beginning of the passage and I would start through it again. And I get my, what I was looking for finally was, because Wallace's thing is he does repeat himself. He's trying very hard to, sometimes too hard, to give us an experience of what human beings experience in these situations. And that necessarily involves repetition, because our lives are like that. We repeat our patterns. And then when we meet somebody who is living a similar pattern, even though they may work in a completely different field, we'll feel a connection to that person because we recognize that in them. And so if you can think of the different settings, including a tennis court, as kind of a hierarchy of places, and the same events are occurring within them. The same responses from individual characters are happening there. It's almost like, you have a color wheel, and I'm trying to think of a simple way to say this. So it's all different shades of the same color. It's just different intensity of it. And every so often he'll throw something in that sort of complicates it, like the Eshkatan game, took the difference between a map and territory into a third level now, where a map in one point of view can be a territory in another point of view. One is something you look at that tells you where something's happening. The other is you're actively involved in it. And then the third is you've got overlap between the two. And so I would go back and just begin again. And the other thing is to really pay attention, for me, that helped was once we got the timeline figured out, I knew what year, and then I started looking at months, and then I started looking at actually at the times of day. And for a while I tried to even track it out, but that just became tedious. But the idea that at the same time that, there's a lot of things that happen on April 1st, for instance. And you realize that 300 pages apart, simultaneous events are happening in these two different spheres that are related. And then it begins to pull it back together. So it's almost like he gave us a puzzle to solve, but I don't think that was ever his intention. His idea was, to me, that we would see these human behaviors, we would have the experience of them, and then where that connected with our experience of life is where there would be some kind of growth or understanding, or a thought would be generated that we could expand on as we move forward. So that's what I do. I stop and I go back, and things that are like landmarks, like Endnote 24 is sort of a landmark in the novel. I mean, I just keep a bookmark in there, and anytime a film is mentioned, I'm going back there to see, right, is this consistent with what Endnote 24 said? And if it isn't, knowing how meticulously this novel was constructed and how much time was spent in the editing process, that it was actually 50% thicker when it began. Why was that error left in? Was it intentional? And it was, and I don't always have the answer as to why, but I really believe that it really was intentional with that. So I think, Jessica, in the interview you posted yesterday, it may have been that, or it may have been in his biography, in Max's biography of Wallace, I read that when he moved from philosophy to fiction, he was so elated to learn that he could repeat himself to make a point. And I know, and the point in your interview was they asked about why so much tennis, and he just said, well, it's the thing I know. I picked that sport because it's the one that I actually know something about and I follow. And so if you don't have any kind of background in tennis, which I didn't the first time I came to this novel, it's dull, right? But then you read the inner game of tennis, and then you read the inner game of work, the two self-help business books that sort of relate around tennis. And you begin to understand, okay, tennis is like most sports, a metaphor for life or for combat or for the business world or for getting an education or for interacting with a family. So, is that helpful?
Yeah.
I wonder if there isn't a literary dilemma. Well, I know that there is at some point when you say that last bit. If the role of art in the literature is to imitate the repetition and even dullness of our own existence, then I wonder at some level why we need it. We have an expectation that art is going to do something more than that, and so we dispense with all the non-essentials. You know, I don't need to know how someone's bowel movements work, you know, that kind of thing. So you get rid of those sorts of bits of literature and we get to the important things and we go from there. And what Wallace is doing, I think this goes back to what Noah's original concern was, is that he's not dispensing with all that. He lets us see sometimes every breath, every bit of perspiration that Lyle is going to lick off, you know, the kids as they perform. And it's like, is there I guess a dilemma that an artist has in wanting to, at one level, communicate the human experience, but knowing that human experience is repetitive and dull, and yet that's part of the theme that you want to kind of suggest anyway, versus our, as you were saying earlier, our reader expectation. We go into a text expecting it to move us, shape us, be different from us at some level. And I don't know exactly where to place the problem there, except that somewhere I think that our readerly expectation is for art to move us away from our existence, not to reinforce our existence. And somewhere that is where the tragedy and despair in this work is starting to work on me.
Well, I guess moving us away from our experience is one thing, or could it also serve to bring to our awareness part of our experience that hasn't been consciously available to us because it's been presented to us, you know, in a different form.
Sure.
And as we get further into these next, you know, couple hundred pages, his knowledge, and it's much deeper than mine, and most of the people in this group probably have much deeper knowledge in some of this than I do, but of the philosophers, of Hegel and of Lacan and Wittgenstein and all that, that's going to start to stand out. I mean, you're going to see characters acting in ways that are like, oh, that's the mirror stage, you know. Oh, that's transcendental time right there, or and they're concepts that we've all heard, but he's actually showing them with human beings, you know, now acting in that respect. So, and then the other thing is with you know, I know Wallace, you can find where he goes both ways about, yeah, he used postmodern techniques in this thing, but he kind of doesn't like to think of himself as a postmodernist because postmodernism is too ironic, even though he's ironic on every page, kind of thing. Now where was I going with this? He wow, train left the station.
That's all right.
I have a question. So based on what Steve, you were saying about the isolation and this idea that art is designed to move us away from our existence or toward existence, I'm wondering if there's an intentional juxtaposition between the isolation that the character is feeling with the entertainment culture. Isn't that part of what we're supposed to be teasing out from this? Is this isolation is only that much more profound because of the art that we're choosing to consume? And like the idea that art is no longer art in the way that it's inspirational or in that way, but amusement and the whole even negation of muse, or meaning the not, and then the muse meaning inspiration. So I'm thinking the amusement, the entertainment, that kind of thing is no longer getting us closer to our existence the way that it
Right.
might have meant it was maybe intended to.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I also draw a very distinct line between art and entertainment. I mean, in that sense, because so much of entertainment is dull, it's working to dull us. I keep looking for Huxley references in this text. I haven't found them yet, but it strikes me that they've got to be there somewhere. I'm still looking. But Orwell, I got, you know, oh, I'm trying to think, Burgess, I've got, but I'm looking for Huxley because it obviously the role of the medication of the drugs of the entertainment tapes and everything else is meant to dull our existence, and it works that way. I guess I'm speaking more towards a more noble venture than the capitalist operations of entertainment production. But no, I think you're absolutely right. That's what's happening. And so this text is reflecting that in some way. I guess I'm expecting of this text, and maybe I'm expecting this text to be an artistic rendering of this non-artistic delivery of entertainment to the characters and to us. And that's, it is, I'm enjoying it for that. And I guess that's goes back to what I was saying with Noah earlier in those stages, sections which seem like a slog to me, is I'm enjoying the craft and the language and the experience of that where it happens. I mean, you can look at Andy Warhol's paintings and shrug your shoulders at them, but he's doing a lot of the same sort of thing. I can listen to Philip Glass operas and enjoy them. When people around me get really uncomfortable and say, "What the hell is going on?" You know, so I get that notion of it. So that's why I guess I say I feel like there's something else going on, and Stephen was starting to open up something for me there, but I feel like there's some other layers, and the discussion of the novel is structured with a kind of like this unlocking or opening, fractal kind of opening and building that started to capture me recently. So I'm starting to think of it in those terms. So my expectations are different, I guess, as I get into those. Yeah, there are a slog through that section, but I'm not dismayed by them yet.
Yeah.
I find that idea interesting, Jessica, the way you articulated, and Steve, how you were processing that with the distinction between art and entertainment, because I find that in my everyday life when there is, but it's more so for me to get rid of a negation. So I'll find myself just mindlessly bored, and so I'll just go on social media, or I'll play one of those stupid, addicting, colorful mobile games that will suck me in for 2 or 3 hours in order to dull the boredom. But after a while, I find myself back with this sense of negation and nothing that the boredom didn't have, where it almost feels better to be bored rather than to be doing something mindless. Mm-hmm. And I feel that tension with how I'm reading it, the long, drawn-out sections, not in the sense of that they're less than boredom, but that it feels like it's trying to fill the sort of negation. Mm-hmm. The negation of what I'm not for sure yet, but I think Wallace is trying to draw out this distinction of art and entertainment and boredom within how it's playing between the three.
I think that you're right, but I think he's got something else going on too that, you know, Steve, you kind of said you sense there's something else there. And he's in simple terms, he's exploring the limits of language to capture experience and to mimic life and to give, and for us to share our lives with other people. You know, he's looking at, and he's looking at both sides of it. He's looking at language as, you know, kind of that solipsist view of if you can't, if there aren't words that you can articulate it with, then it can't exist for you. Or but he's challenging us to say, if you don't have the vocabulary to understand what's happening here, then get it, right? Engage in a conversation, expand your world so that it becomes clearer what this experience is about. And in one of the Little Buddy talks, Hal talks about the idea that, or maybe he's reflecting on it. I have to go back and find the passage that, you know, just as being high takes away the pain, but then not being high, you feel the pain again. The mastery of tennis and victory takes away the pain, but then you're back at 5 a.m. drills and right in the heat of all the pain again. And then there's all the attendant anxiety that goes around both of those experiences. It doesn't matter whether you are addicted to a substance, whether you're addicted to a thought in your head, or you're addicted to something you're doing with your body. You're filling a void, and there's pain when that void isn't filled. And that's maybe the part about the novel being sad, you know, that Wallace was getting at with that. But I think he's trying to do all this with language, and admittedly, it's sometimes very cinematic language, and other times it is just dry as desert dirt. I mean, I agree with that. So, but the conversation about it seems to me like, I still think, you know, from the outset, I felt like that's what this novel was for. It wasn't to be read in isolation. It was to be part of a community of people that are responding and reacting to the things in it. That's what I love about this book. There's nobody who doesn't have an opinion on it if they've gotten through it. So.
You talk about the language. I'm thoughtful of what I say to my students when I give them Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And for my seniors, that's about as tough as they're ever going to meet in high school. And they immediately, the response is, no, 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 no. Those sentences are too long. The paragraphs are too thick. And I propose to them that, you know, part of Conrad's agenda isn't that he merely has a large vocabulary and wants it, but that he wants to offer you the density of this wilderness and of this passage into the human consciousness and how dense it truly is. And he wants you to take a kind of a verbal machete and hack your way through these sentences. Otherwise, you're just going to be, it's a page turner. And the consciousness is not about, you know, becoming a page turner. It's about something where you immerse yourself in the complexity and the density and the ambiguity of it all.
Right.
That's one of the first times I think for them and as high school students that we talk about the impact of language style as being part of its meaning. Mm-hmm. So it's not actually, and I sense this with a lot of Wallace's stuff too, is that it isn't necessarily that it's big words for the sake of big words or vocabulary or anything else, but that in addition to communicating everything that they do, that the mere thickness or there's another word I'm looking for, but I'll come up on it later. But the mere thickness of it itself is part of that experience, is part of what he's trying to do. And I think I think Noah said before, it's a distance, a psychological distance between the reader and the text is created, and it's in that experience that part of the meaning resides. Mm-hmm. It's contrary to what we talked about last week, or what we talked about last week is that the meaning is in the text. The meaning isn't merely in the text, in that it must exist in the interaction with the text. So. Mm-hmm.
Well, and even looking at, you know, the language construction, yes, he's got more than his share of $15 words in there, mm-hmm. but he also has acronyms, you know, throughout it, abbreviations, words that he's mashed together and made up whole new meanings for. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I mean, stylistically, he is playing with language at a very high level. And yet there's a consistency to that even. It's interesting to me how many things are introduced as an acronym first, and you have to go pages and pages before you know what that means, you know. The UHID was out there for quite a while before we actually knew what that was.
Right.
And so that's, you know, I think it's obviously intentional. He wants you to wonder and think about it and see what you come up with. I mean, I've come up with some funny wrong acronyms over time in this novel, you know, and there's ones that I forget and that I have to go back and look up when I run across them again. AC/DC was one that I ran across this week, and it was like, gosh, what was that?
Yeah.
It's not a band in Australia.
That's right.
That's really interesting that you bring up like the acronyms and the way he's messing with the language, because I noticed at one point he was using an acronym or a way of writing. Maybe it was the W/ to say with or with respect to. And then I noticed in a different narrative section, that was completely gone. So it would have said with respect to outright. I'm trying to find what that was specifically, but I think he's also trying to show that language is constructed per the character and how the narrative's trying to be focalized to us. So it's not that we get all the acronyms and have our own little dictionary off to the side and we're able to read the story. It's we have to read the story with the language that the character is using.
Yep.
Right.
There's I got an advertisement, an email this week for a new dictionary that's coming out, and it's a dictionary that all the definitions are based on usage rather than on any kind of formal structure. And so it has all of the text message acronyms, you know, all the shortenings and abuses of language. But I guess all change in language, as I think about it, is something that happens through usage. You know, it's just, and it's been a simplification of language over the last 150 years. I mean, you look at a 19th century novel and the way that there's so many archaic words in there that we don't even use anymore, or if somebody does use them, everybody's going, oh, just showing off their education kind of thing. And that's one of the other things that's interesting to me about this novel is that there's a timeless quality to it, just in the sense of by not letting us know what years corresponded to the sponsored years for the first fifth of the novel. We don't link it up to our own knowledge of events. And for me, I'm able to suspend disbelief better that way and accept that he's, that language is fluid and it's going to change. I think it'd be really interesting, again, if David Foster Wallace were alive, to get his reaction to the way people communicate today over social media. Because he was kind of not into that.
Right.
But now it's so pervasive, and yet it is totally the language of this book, in my head at least. So
he not in so direct ways. He does touch upon a little bit in his short rant against the video phone.
Yes.
Communication, and he talks about that annihilation of that advanced technology, that reductionism that goes on, and so at some level he anticipated our unwillingness to communicate fully, but to retreat into a communication which was in a safer space, private space for us. The audio only, and I would imagine thus text messaging is so much easier to text, than it is to actually use audio, and above that is video. So that reductionism is just one step away from his rant. So I can kind of anticipate where he'd go with that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because then you get into anonymity when you go to the audio, you know, and we just had the discussion in the earlier group this morning about authenticity. There's a good example of a way maybe that we lose our authenticity by not having the video in that case. We don't have that immediate interaction. That's one of those great fractal moments too. I don't know if, there was the real short bit early in the novel about the history of the video phone and how it collapsed. All right, he circles back to that very soon. If you haven't got there yet, you will very soon. Yeah,
Okay.
and it connects directly to what's going on with the macro story. So it's kind of an important moment with regard to that. So that was interesting. You saw that, you were starting to see the fractals playing out. And went,
Yeah.
I can point to that. Actually. Yeah. So.
Well, it's fascinating that even then when you talked, and I don't know what you talked about this morning, and when you talk about video as being more authentic, he pushed away from that very quickly. He said it was because it was authentic that people retreated, but they ended up creating simulacrons of themselves, photoshopping essentially, or video shopping.
Avatars, yeah.
Avatars, and it's interesting what that does. We end up creating personalities, digital personalities for ourselves, and that's happening right now too. We do it all over the place. Like you say, the avatar is the replacement personality, the public persona. Even when you get into something as simple as Ready Player One, which was like back from the 90s and where that began, we've seen that for a long time. It's nothing more than a narcissistic mask at some level. I'll just stay with that. It's a mask we put on, which makes me wonder at what level what level authenticity is even possible.
Well, it's interesting because this sort of ties in with the idea of a postmodern concept versus a postmodern concept, and the idea that in postmodernism we can articulate the problem, the inauthenticity of the masks that we wear on social media. That would be an example. And then postmodernism would say, okay, so as an individual, what's my solution to that? And that was sort of where the discussion we had earlier today in the critical thinking group seemed to be headed, was the idea of, to live an authentic life. I mean, you almost have to live, first of all, with the assumption that there's a candid camera on you 24/7. And then secondly, you have to be okay with that. And you have to say, there's no way that I can keep up this false persona 24/7. So I just have to, if I care about what the world thinks of me, then I need to live a life that I'm proud to be seen, to have seen by anybody, anytime, anywhere. And
anything else is exhausting.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe that was Jessica, that was the point you were trying to make earlier, was that you can only sustain a lie so long. You have to have a break from it every now and again. And if you're,
I think there's just, because of the surveillance era that we're in, transparency of communication and the way things are moving, and our frustration with old thinkers who lived lives that were inauthentic. We find out all of these indiscretions and these things that don't align with our values. I think that's where that tension comes in. So now that we're in this era of sort of increased transparency and hyper surveillance, I think that our thinkers now, our intellectuals now, are going to be vastly different from our philosophers of ages past, because everything's going to be known. There's nothing that someone wouldn't be able to find out about you. So if you do have values that are a certain way, it's almost going to be more accepted anyway, but that's going to be part of who you are. You're not going to try to hide it. It's sort of what we're thinking through. It's just a different time, but I feel like people are accepting of that. I don't know, Noah, if you have an opinion on this, but there's sort of this underlying sentiment that privacy is a right and that we shouldn't, like, all of our stuff shouldn't be read by the government and all of these things. And then I feel like that there's this new wave kind of coming up, like, let them see it. Who cares? Like, we're doing what we want to do.
Yeah.
Like if
Yeah.
they see it, what's the big deal? That kind of thing. So I don't know if you're feeling that at all, Noah, or you can speak to where kids are these days with the college students that you're, in charge of and leading, or even Steve, like the sentiment that you feel with the younger generation.
Yeah, I would definitely agree there is a sentiment that, and I sometimes feel this too. It's like, well, if someone is anonymously surveying me, they don't know me, I don't know them. There is this disconnection of, well, so what if they know everything about who I am and where I live and my social security numbers? Like, it doesn't really matter. But then there's a sense that I've seen recently, specifically in a podcast I recently listened to, where that anonymity can kind of go away and people can reach out through our technology and really make that influence. The biggest example that can affect all of us is people stealing our identity and taking our credit cards and wreaking havoc that way. But it's been going to such an extreme where people are being what's called swatted, where
Yeah.
it's this thing where people will do live streams and someone will figure out where that person is and then call the police and say there's a terrorist there, and the SWAT team literally comes in on the live stream, and it's supposed to be this big joke.
Mhm.
But there's a sense of, okay, who cares, who knows everything about me, except when that person has that power to reach back out to you.
Mhm. Yeah, doxing, again, the same kind of concept. Yeah, we call people out, call out their real identities because the false one has been discovered.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, Jessica, you're right that sensibility for younger people has changed. I mean, my students, I don't have the same kinds of conversations about privacy with my high school students that we used to have. And that notion of private life, I can see some of them desperately trying to section off parts of their lives so that only certain groups will know that aspect of them and everything else. But in academic discussions, they largely don't see the problems because A, they haven't met them. They're too young to have met those problems. But B, they've seen it played out in every kind of medium that they've engaged, from YouTube to celebrity scandals to everything else, and politicians. It is that. I think it's interesting, though, too, when you talk about how philosophers will have to be, will look different, will sound different. And I think that's really interesting. I was thinking about Derrida decades ago, who talked about that notion. What did he want to know most about? He said, the sex lives of philosophers. People wonder, why do you want to know about the sex lives of philosophers? And it's because that's the thing that no one's writing about. What was Aristotle except what we know from his writings? His private life is completely unknown to us virtually in that sense. And so we know him and revere him because of his writings, but we don't know him and revere him because of his personal life. And what philosopher is ever going to get away with that again? Be able to just put out text and never be known.
So I wonder if we can't make a connection between this issue of, privacy and public mass and what's going on in the novel with the AA meetings. And, early on, Don Gately muses that if he accepted Pat's logic, the director of Enid House, everybody would be in some form of addiction and recovery program. And then you get to the meetings and the things that they talked about. I think I put it in what I posted this week for a lesson, was the idea that those 12 steps require complete honesty and basically a surrender of your privacy to, but it's an individual choice, and you're the one that's responsible for it, and you're the one that bears the consequences if you choose not to live that way. I mean, it just seems like there's a really strong tie with that microscopic behavior you look at the addiction to entertainment in society, and the solution is, perhaps some kind of dispassionate inventory of our own failings and then a public accounting for them in order to move beyond the addiction and into a life we can be proud of and authentic with. So it's interesting how that kind of seems like it's a parallel. Am I the only one that's seeing that? Am I fitting the peg in the hole? Or?
Well, I'm reminded of one of the films that was in there, and the one that there were several of them I just laughed out loud at. But the one that irritated the audiences so much because it was just cameras focused on the audience and they were watching themselves watch the film. No one wants that. Nobody.
Right. But then again, I would say that a fully actualized person or one who was living an authentic life would be indifferent to that. It'd be fine.
Right.
You know? So.
Unless they were narcissists, but yes.
The narcissist would love it, and they'd say, "Oh, you're not showing the good side, right?
That's right.
Let me fix my hair." So,
You were talking earlier, Stephen. I don't mean to divert, but I was thinking about this last night, and I was talking with my girlfriend who is not reading the book, so she's having to weather my occasional tirades and I don't know where. And I was talking about the notion of the impact of these years that have been commodified. And one of the things that they've done, and I haven't seen it reflected so clearly in the text, but I imagine that it would. It denied me as a reader, first of all, chronology, obviously. And so I had to go back, and I noted how desperate I was to try to find the chronology.
mm-hmm.
And before you and some others had, I've obviously published it in an order, and I could say, okay, that's helpful to me. But then I wondered why I was so desperate for that chronology and what the impact of not having a numerical year does to our notion of causality.
Oh, yeah.
And I started thinking of these chapters thereby as this enormous, take the theme of waste, cesspool of non-active movement. There's nothing there, coupled with Hal's 7th grade paper on Frank Furillo and whoever the Hawaii Five-0 guy is.
Steve McGarrett.
And he said, what we really need, the next phase is going to be the non-active hero, the one who doesn't move. I thought, this is the culture, the society that's being built here. In every way, shape, and form, I can never identify causal links anymore, nor do I have to worry so much about the notion of progress. We can all be in this just morass of isolation and a new wave of things being sold to us and things to consume, but not have to worry that we're going anywhere. And it was just a subtle thing. I thought, my gosh, I really rely on those numbers, and that sense of forward motion, whether it's illusory or not.
Mm-hmm.
We could argue the cycles of history and everything, and that progress is an illusion, but I really needed that illusion, and I thought that was so. It's an interesting effect that I was ranting about last night. Is that look at what he's done to me. Anyway, I haven't gone much further with that idea than that, except that it does seem to suit the rest of the book so far, in that these characters aren't necessarily going anywhere. It is that repetitious cycle of non-progress, and so is it a surprise that they fall into non-existence?
So then,
go ahead, Noah.
Do you think with these sections of introspection that are extremely long and detailed, what you are searching for, Steve, then is whatever you can find to make that progress?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think like you are Because I feel like I'm almost doing this myself in the way I'm reading it. I'm trying to transcribe some sort of order, meaning, narrative to this mess and chaos in order to try to make that progress.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I just found that interesting.
Yeah, one of the fundamentals of the genre narrative is that there's a chronology that moves us forward, and that it's not necessarily working by those rules here. I think there are people who are, at some level, some of the characters are attempting to seek change and move us forward, foolishly or not, but by and large, the entropy of the whole culture is dragging everything down, and that's under the weight of this capitalist kind of blank check that they've got, you know.
Well, the lack of a chronology, especially early in the novel, I mean, it absolutely disconnects you from your own reality.
Mhm.
And if you look at the various groups that have tried to read this collectively over the years, there's thousands and thousands of pages online of people that have tried and failed to read Infinite Jest. And that is probably the number one reason that people put the book down. It's because they don't have a sense of the chronology of it for so long. And it's why I so strongly encourage you to keep reading until you get that. Because
Yeah.
once you get that, it's like you can take a breath and you can pay attention to the story. And then I had to think about, so why would David Foster Wallace as a writer do that other than just to make his point of, I want you disconnected from your reality? Well, why does he want me disconnected from my reality? Well, it's partly to enter into his, but the other thing is, if I'm putting a 1,000-page novel out there, I don't expect it to be the flavor of the week. You know, I expect it to be around for as long as Ulysses or the Odyssey or Hamlet, right? And if he had written this, and I've actually, the lesson that goes up Sunday, I've got some stuff on this in there. The idea that if he had written this and we knew immediately that the year of Glad was 2010, and that's where we're starting, right?
Mhm.
Then, because we live in a world where information is immediately and thoroughly dispersed, we have more available to us than we've ever had at any time in our lives. We then start to bounce our experience up against that timeline, which is so important to us. And so we're thinking, oh, it's 2010. Gee, I wonder if we have a black president. Gee, I wonder if in this world we're still in Iran and Afghanistan. Gee, I wonder if the Twin Towers actually got knocked down in this world. And all of this stuff that sets it in a particular place and time in our minds and takes our thoughts away from what the point he's really trying to make, which is about the culture, not about the historical events around the culture.
Right.
And the history that he presents, I mean, at the time he wrote the novel, and again, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but you know, the politics in here, the first time I read this, it was pure satire, right? The election of 2016 completely changed that in the way I look at this novel now. It totally changed it. And when you get to that part where you meet the powers that be and get their history, you know, it's like, holy cow, I know he wrote this thinking there's no way this could ever happen, but, right? So I think that it is necessary for the novel, as you said, Steve. It's that to be consistent with what David Foster Wallace was trying to do, he could not give us a chronology up front. And that's even though we have that now, I talk about paying attention to it and knowing where you're at, because even though the scenes are longer, and right now we're just jumping back and forth between April and November of the year of the Depend adult undergarment, right? But we're coming up on a place where those time shifts can get you just as lost as you were at the beginning of the novel if you don't pay attention. And, you know, with all of these different plot threads starting to intersect now, because we've got the wheelchair assassins, we've got the pursuit of the entertainment cartridge, the master copy of it. We've got stuff going on at Enid House. We've got all this AA activity going on around town. We've got Hal's decline, and then the kind of expansion of the other characters at the tennis academy. Plus, you've still got the Incandenza family history going on. and Oren and Avril are intimately connected to the central plot of this thing, you know, and there's some surprises about characters from all of these places that turn up before the thing actually gets to its climax. And there are big time jumps that happen around all of that. If you're not paying attention, you're just going to say, it still looks like a broken mirror to me, you know? So I mean, I think there's a consistency about that disorienting feeling that you have. And that's part of the process of experiencing this novel, is to just sit with that and let it take you on. You know, let that take you forward. The take a breath and just sit with it kind of thing.
Early on in what you just said, you mentioned that you didn't think Wallace ever expected anything like this to ever happen. You believe that? You don't think he was anticipating anything? Do you think he was just fantasizing and wanted to talk about addiction and loneliness, but really not worry about so much the social future?
I think he worried about it. I just don't think he ever imagined it could go to the point where, you know, I mean, you could seriously entertain the idea that a government of the president of the United States could shoot somebody in cold blood on the street and get away with it, you know. And now you can seriously entertain that idea. At least I can. And yeah, I kind of always look back to, you know, people like Lincoln talking about how if this democracy or this nation ever fails, it will be from within. And I thought that warning itself was strong enough to kind of sustain the parts of our political structures and government structures and that I value, that seem to have the good of, you know, the population at large at their heart. And yeah, that could all be laid waste to. No, that surprises me, you know, and I think it would surprise Wallace, although maybe not. I don't know. His mind was definitely on levels way above where I really could even aspire to at this point. So,
I just remember a couple of times really anxious about a growing our country setting themselves up for fascism, a fascism of the media, a fascism of the narrative. Whoever controls the narrative, you know, that's always that's always the question. Whoever's in charge of the narrative controls the ability to allow us our free choice or not. And you know, we've been heading there for a long while.
Yeah.
As we get people in with competing narratives. So, yeah, that's which is why I'm still intrigued at another level by our own discussion of the narrative here, about what if he's taking control of a narrative that breaks the rules of narrative. You know, I don't have my head around what that question is yet. That's what's forming in my head.
I think, you know, part of what he was doing was trying to take like the early postmodernists like Pynchon and Gaddis and take the best of what they had, but then just give it a contemporary spin and to do more to involve the reader in making sense of it. And I mean, when we get to Gravity's Rainbow and Recognitions, I'm going to have to take some smart pills to be able to flesh it all out, because there we're looking at, you know, direct ties to world events and things that happened 60, 80 years ago. So it's going to be interesting. Has anyone gotten far enough to run across the use of fake news in the novel yet? It's actually in there.
That's crazy, really?
Yeah. And the other word that keeps popping up is millennial. Over and over.
David Foster Wallace.
Yep. But I don't think he's credited with either of those things.
That's because he would have to be read.
Yeah, exactly. So
it's really interesting. I feel like he's tapping into that to this generation in such a profound way. I feel like he should get the credit.
Mhm.
So in your reading guide, you had David Markson, and you left some comments about how he was thinking through the 600 pages that were cut from David Foster Wallace's book. So
Mhm.
David Markson, is that the same author who wrote Wittgenstein's Mistress?
Yes.
Okay, so Wittgenstein makes an appearance in here.
Um, Not Wittgenstein per se,
Well, I know. I mean,
but oh
that's true.
yeah,
We read Murakami, who puts, Colonel Sanders in his book. So it's
That's
not
right.
Wittgenstein per se, but some of,
yeah,
I guess, the residual thoughts and
yeah,
philosophy.
absolutely. Oh, definitely, yeah, yeah, and that was, I mean, to me, that was a big part of what he was trying to do with this novel, was to process his own feelings about Wittgenstein.
Okay.
Just the idea that, and the way that Wittgenstein's thought changed from Tractatus to philosophical investigations over his career. That whole thing about language and how, we can only know what we can describe with our language. And then just the rejection of that. No, wait a minute. We can always expand our language to know more. So yeah, I mean, I almost think that's like the paper that this is written on, in a sense.
So we're going to be reading Wittgenstein, both of those works that you just mentioned, and David Markson's work for our fiction for the first half of 2019 in Critical Theory and Philosophy. So that intrigued me. It made me kind of want to put them sooner on the list so that this can be fresh in our minds when we start Wittgenstein.
I want to be there for those.
That's very cool. I have not read Wittgenstein. I have, I think, both of those works, but I just have not read them yet. So
Me either. So I mean, I dig through them to find things, that relate to what I read about Wallace. But as far as sit down and do a cover to cover, nope.
yeah.
But
Somewhere back in grad school, but I don't remember enough to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fun rethinking through these things and seeing the way, I think, I like seeing the way these things emerge in anything I read. So that's kind of neat. I like those connections.
So I wanted to ask if, are you all just reading the novel and then, looking at any material that shows up on the Facebook page or that I might put out there, or are you using other resources? Because there's so much out there. I was just curious where anyone might have gone with that.
I haven't touched anything really from another resource yet. And truth be told, Stephen, I've been putting the energy that I do have for it in the text. And I'm only now just catching up on your reading guides. And
I
go
think
back
you should put it in the text.
Yeah, so I do that. Then I'll read your reading guide usually a week and a half later than I should be reading it. And then I go back and say, oh, well, good. At least I saw that, but I didn't realize that. That makes much more sense. No, I'm just not finding the time to explore behind it. But as you say, I can certainly sense that there's got to be vast communities out there.
Yeah, there are. But and I was curious about it if anybody was doing it, because I know there's at least one other member of the group that has, and part of why I think people fail in reading this is they get just overwhelmed with the amount of interpretation that's out there. I think when you're reading this book, the reason I say look at the text first is because your interpretation is the first one that matters, with respect to this. And otherwise, it is just an entertainment, if you want to know what everybody else thought. But if you read it and then you have your thoughts and then you can bounce that against other people, then it becomes a conversation, and then we can maybe address some of what is being brought to light. So.
I'm not reading anything else. I watched the movie when I was reading this the first time. I wanted to see who's the actor that plays in that? Jason Segel?
Yes.
Yeah, so I watched that movie back when I was reading this the first time, and I have his biography, it's his biography. You said it was Max?
Yeah, DT Max.
Yeah, so I have that, but and then I have some of his other works and essays. I'd rather let Wallace interpret Wallace.
Right. No, that's good. it's all in here, but it's not all in here on one reading. That's the thing about this book. And I mean, I think we can get a lot of it. We can get at it to where then if there's something that does interest somebody, they can go back and read it again. Like you talked about possibly a chronological reading at some point, you know, Jessica. You brought that up. I went and dug that out again and just read through the whole thing. And I thought, no, it would have ruined the book if it'd been done.
Really?
Yeah. I really think it would have ruined the book if you'd read it in chronological order. So, because the plot's not that deep, you know, it is a thematic. I mean, well, then again, the plot wasn't that deep in 1996. Maybe in 2018 it is, you know.
I think that's a testament to where that comment came from. It was just someone, you know, saying that on Twitter where people aren't willing to put in the work, like what you're saying. People aren't willing to work for what they read in any capacity. So I think it's true to where people are in this current moment, as far as that's what people need, is to sort of make it make sense and get it quick, get a quick payoff.
Right.
Just that.
So what do we make of the notion of erasing one's own map that comes out several times in here? Joelle Van Dyne's attempted suicide, for instance. Have you all gotten that far? I hope. And just in light of, because Wallace talks about this a lot, we know that James Incandenza committed suicide. We know that Joelle made at least a very, very serious attempt at it. We've got Kate Gompert, who's in, you know, deep or close supervision because of hers. And is that just incidents he's put in here, do you think, or was it something that he's suggesting people should consider as an option if they can't handle life? I mean, we know Wallace's biography, but you know, at 33 years old, what? And does it relate to anything that you encounter with people in your lives? That's the other interesting thing for me. Is, you know, it seems like it's one of those taboos we don't talk about, is people's thoughts about ending it. Like I mean, and I'll be vulnerable. I had a moment in freshman year in college where I was just it was like the whole world felt like it was caving in, you know. And I can't even tell you what it was all about, but I do remember standing and looking at the corner of the metal bunk bed and thinking all I'd have to do is grab both sides and slam my nose into it and it'd be over in a flash. And that's the only time I can ever remember feeling that way. And it passed, thank goodness. But is that something you just kind of pass over, or do you stop and think about it when you get to those moments?
I have a lot of people in my life who've thought about it, so it's something I think through within that context, and who've been hospitalized and whatnot. So, and then Bethany, who was in our critical theory and philosophy conversations, she is in the military, and so she's dealing with people. I think since September, they've lost 5 people within, I say unit, but that makes it sound small. It's not small. So, and right now in this season, suicides are supposed to be amplified within the military. So, and I was actually just reading something earlier last week, because I read Dostoevsky's The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. I posted it in our book club. So on his birthday, I posted that, which happened to be Veterans Day. And I was looking up whether or not this time of year is the dominant time for people to take their life just in general, or if that's just exclusive to military. And it looked like the spring was when they usually did, just statistically. So I hit it from different angles, if that makes sense. Literature, I think, reading a lot of the early thinkers, especially women, Sylvia Plath and some others who've thought through that notion and the idea of taking their own life. So I've thought about it from different angles, for sure. I've had students who've expressed the same tendencies or thoughts, if that makes sense. And I think there's no right way. It's just people need a place to talk about it. Absolutely. I come back to that all the time. I feel like whether it's reading and sort of identifying yourself with another character, I think that there's something to be said for reading as therapy in that way. And I mean, that's part of why I wanted to share that story last week. It's part of why some of the readers I think through I want us to talk about. That idea of loneliness and despair, I feel like is very common. It's why community is so huge to me. It's the sort of the answer to that in my own head. If you have a place to talk and connect over ideas, you're not going to feel so isolated. You're not going to feel that sense of despair. You're not going to stare into the abyss and think that there's no way out. You're going to make a different choice. So I think about it a little bit. Not like it, but I think about suicide in general for whatever reason. It's crossed my mind, but not in a real way, not the way it does for other people, not in like the thinking about it way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Real quick on more of a theoretical, in the theoretical sphere, Jean Baudrillard, the French thinker who talks about hyperreality, he has this aphorism where he says, it's not enough to die, you must learn to disappear. So the idea of erasing your map is the idea of disappearing in an entertainment culture where so much of our significance is derived from the visual stimulation, from the experience of the signs, and we make meaning from putting those signs together and creating the narrative. I think that's part of why that is so profound in his work, is because you have to erase it. Otherwise, which we've talked about, I think, in these conversations as well, I'm sure that you've got people who have passed away, but are still friends on Facebook, and people still post on their walls and say happy birthday and things like that. So there's still a performance of their identity in some regard. So as far as suicide goes, as far as that goes, I feel like for David Foster Wallace, he would be appalled by the fact that that suicide then sort of catapulted him into the hyper appearance. Just, he's everywhere, right? It sort of, I mean, he was already well regarded and famous as far as authors go, but I feel like he would be appalled by sort of the way it's transitioned. I don't know if that's right, evolved, the way his identity has evolved because of his death, because of his choice. I don't know if he would agree or not.
Well, I know a lot of people have gone back to, especially Infinite Jest, to read through and to interpret it as a psychoanalytic understanding of David Foster Wallace himself. And so when these moments of characters trying to commit suicide or do commit suicide, they try to relate it back to the author in terms of, okay, what is going on in his psyche? And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, because again, how much of there is the death of the author, literally and figuratively here, for us to be able to connect between the art and his actions.
Well, I would kind of say that, at least with respect to that, it'd be hard to make a connection. And it more has to do with sort of, you peel back the onion one more layer and you look at suicides, there's not just one kind of a suicide. You know, I mean, you look at the history of the Tamil people in India, the deliberate political suicides that were done to make a political statement. And then there's the suicide of despair, which we're seeing some in this book. But then there's also what's the suicide of James in Condensa about? I mean,
right.
What's that about? Why does he erase his map? Other than, is the alcohol the explanation, or was there something deeper going on? Had he finished his work once he created the entertainment cartridge of Infinite Jest and it was rejected, he decided he couldn't show it to the world. And then there's the slow suicides that are going on. People who life doesn't really have any meaning for them, but they don't have the initiative to take the last step. So instead they do it slowly with alcohol or fast driving or
Yeah.
those kind of things. I mean, somebody suggested, I don't remember who it was, something I read a while back and I haven't been able to find it since, but that this novel was about death as much as it was about anything. That all these characters in here are trying to process their own mortality and to find, something to give their lives meaning so that there's no need
Right.
for that. So that, because that's really all we have to hope for. We're all kind of caught in the same boat, right? Alan Watts said that the minute we're born, we're kicked off a cliff. We just don't know how high or how far it is to the bottom. And it's what we do on the way down that defines us. And so I don't know, I'm kind of drawn to that as I think about, some of the deeper meanings that Wallace might have had in mind, because I think he was seeking meaning for his own life as well. And the fact that he was so versed in so many fields, he was such a, he was a mathematician, he was a philosopher, he was an author, he was a poet, he was a teacher, he was really able to, even though it seemed like he was very insecure about it, to interact academically on a lot of levels and intellectually in just about any field he set his mind to. He said politics made him too angry, so he wouldn't get involved in that. But, it's clear that he understood it. So.
Going back to your comment on slow death, do you think that entertainment can be a manifestation of that?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do.
Is it bizarre that reading used to be seen that way? Right? I mean, that breaks my heart. I think about this a lot right now, though, is that reading was supposed to make us stupid, when the printing press was first around and it was going to be common.
Yeah. Well, this will be a spoiler for the lesson that I've got to go up Sunday night, but you do a Google search on David Foster Wallace and you get 92 million hits. You do a Google search on James Patterson and you get over 600 million hits.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
So there is slow death by reading. It's not this book, though.
That's right. Yeah. It goes back to what we were talking about before. What are you reading and to what end? When you were asking about the characters and their erasure of their own maps, I agree. There are different reasons, but as a general trend, that most of humanity in this book seems to be moving. Let's try it this way: most of the characters in this book seem to be moving away from their own humanity, and by that I mean they are acquiescing to the cheap entertainment that's being fed to them, be it substance or videotape or whatever, and does not require them to reflect, does not require them to find purpose, does not require them to do anything but avoid that self-reflection. And, to go back to the 12-step program discussion that we had earlier, if that 12-step program, or if any rehabilitatory program compels us to reflect upon ourselves, examine our own humanity, then that's the only route to taking the hardest step, and that's to defining and making a purpose for ourselves. Map is supposed to take you somewhere. You erase a map, mean that you don't see that there's anywhere to go. You have no function or use for it. And I think all these characters are on self-destructive tendencies, and the annihilation of the thoughtful, reflective mind is, at least metaphorically, but perhaps more literally, a move towards a more physical self-annihilation. And for me, I find that the mental annihilation that they are finding themselves in is far more tragic than the physical. And those characters who are opting out for conscious reasons have not found a way out, have not found a teleological path, have not found a route or a map out. And so what's the point? It need not be despair. It might just be that everywhere they look, there's a dead end. They don't see a direction or a path. And all they have is this meaninglessness.
Mhm.
You know, I scream at commercials if there are too many of them, you know, in a row. At some tiny level, that's my angst about the meaninglessness that's being thrust at me beyond my control. How long can I endure that? And I think there might be a point where I would say, you know, I'd rather not be the object of this narrative being thrown at me.
Mm-hmm. Well, you
And-
said most of the characters. Is there some that you see aren't on this slow self-destructive course?
I think there are those who are trying to take a stand against it. I don't know that they're thinking of it in those terms yet. And I'm still, you know, early on, I don't know. I'd like to think, and just because I have this romantic inclination to the wheelchair assassins, I'd like to think that at some level they are, some of them at least, is it Machette? What is his name? Machette?
Wrath.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That I'd like to think at some level, as accusatory and insightful as he is against the United States and what it's about, I'd like to say, okay, dude, I'm on your side. Let's see where you can go. But I'm not convinced he's any better off than anybody else yet.
How about Don Gately?
I don't know enough about him yet to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The wheelchair assassins did jump in front of trains, so I guess I can't give them too much credit.
I feel almost so with this idea of knowledge and suicide. It reminds me of Camus' idea of philosophical suicide. It's
Yeah.
the idea that you just live without thinking. And I feel within this text, the characters I'm most drawn to, or that I find I'm the most hopeful about, are the ones who do think. Like Hal, like I would say Orin and Mario, and even Madame Psychosis, the ones who are trying to think their way out of despair.
Mm-hmm.
Mario is one of the most upbeat characters in the whole book, I think. He seems pretty, he's just worried about how mom's feeling about dad's suicide. Other than that, he seems to me like he's pretty grounded, you know, lives his life. And yet he's the Stephen Hawking of the novel is what I call him. So, you know, great things for when your mind is all you have to work with. So.
No, I've been along those lines. I guess I have been thinking about, you know, what options do you have? What options do people have? And there was this line in there when they were talking about the tape. I can't remember the is it a German term for it?
The Samizdat.
Samizdat.
Yeah.
That there was some observation at some point in the book that suggested that they knew that if Americans were given it, they would watch it. And, okay. And they're absolutely right. I mean, of course we would. We just turn it right on. I mean, the Netflix queue runneth over. It's just something that they would put on because it's going to be the highest rated program they will ever see.
And the last.
Yeah, and the last. And that if that means their end, there's this just on a quick sidebar, I think it's a Twilight Zone, but it sounds too gross for a Twilight Zone. Might have been an Outer Limits. Anyway, there's this bookstore that this guy walks into, and the bookstore owner says, you know, browse, your life story is here. Everyone's life story is here. And as he wanders through the bookstore, he sees all these people, and they're stock still staring at these books of their lives. And he asks, well, what's going on? He says, well, they're reading their own autobiographies from birth to death, and they've come upon the happiest moment in their lifetimes. And at that point, they're just caught, because they know that they could turn the page, but there's nothing happier in that book that will ever happen to them. And for like one person, it was like when they were age 7 and they caught a fly ball. And at some point, you have to ask, if you could know when your happiest moment was, your most satisfied, content moment, would you want to know when that would be? And of course not. And it's the most horrifying idea ever. What if I found out it happened a few months ago, and then it's all downhill from here? So of course we don't want to know that. We always have to look forward to something that's, there it goes back to that idea of progress again. I want to progress or move forward to something that is going to be fulfilling. That is what the narrative wants to promise me. And what this videotape does is exactly the opposite. It takes you to a point that says, this will be your happiest moment. So of course, no one ever wants to look away. That means looking back at their own lives that are somewhat less than that. And I'm still speculating on the nature of the tape. I don't know what it is. I certainly haven't seen it. But why would Americans want to watch it? Of course they would. Of course we would. And then why do anything else? So at some level, you've got, I'm sensing a polar response here. At one level, you have an ultimate hedonistic sort of bliss that's offered to you, which is your end. On the other hand, you turn away from that and you risk falling into this despair, despondency pool of purposelessness that the entertainment world has been giving you, in which case that's self-destructive. Is it any wonder, faced with these two choices, some people are just saying this, I'm opting out. And again, I'm just speculating, but this is just, as we talk about it, that's what's the pattern I'm seeing.
Well, the nature of the tape, the nature of the cartridge is interesting. And actually, like so many other things in the book, you're going to have to put it together from pieces that are given to you.
Mm.
But I think just in reflecting on it, the biggest clue thus far in the reading we've done thus far, there's two. One is the actual initial appearance of it when the medical attaché opened it. And it's not about the cartridge, it's about him and his personality and his expectations from life,
Right.
the kind of person he was. And then the second one is that the only credited actress in this thing is the prettiest girl of all time, is Joelle. That's the only person who's in this film. And that his creator then erased his map after it was done and supposedly took the master with him. I don't know if you've got that far.
Yeah.
To his grave, right? And so, I mean, you can begin to see little pieces connecting, but then what's actually in it is where, Jessica, we get to all these philosophers, I think.
Mm.
At least, again, with Wallace, a lot of it is just suggestion. He's not going to come right out and tell you, oh, look, here's Lacan, right?
Right.
He's not like that. He's going to let you fish it out. But so yeah, the cartridges and that conversation with Marath and Steepley, that goes all the way through the novel. That was the one that drove Michael Peach, the editor, crazy. He said, I just can't figure out what this is about. But I mean, to me, that's some of the most interesting stuff because they're talking about mass behavior. They're talking about, the good of the individual versus the good of the whole, individual rights versus responsibility, freedom of choice versus freedom from choice. They've encompassed a lot and I'm still going to climb up to where I think that conversation might have taken place and take a picture of the city from there at sunset so who can see it. Because it's the shadows and all that. There's so much going on there that there's really no wasted words in those short little scenes. So.
The way you phrased that freedom reminded me of a song by Devo, just a sidebar.
Oh, the freedom for and freedom from.
Yeah. lyrics of a Devo song. So.
Oh, okay. Well, you can sing it for us next time.
Next time, let me practice for a while. It requires great talent.
Yeah. Interesting.
Hmm.
So, Noah, you bogged down on the tennis scenes. How do you do with the long AA meetings and digressions into there?
I actually haven't gotten to those scenes yet. I'm a
Okay.
little behind. But otherwise, I find the most discombobulated scenes the most interesting ones.
Okay.
The ones like the cuts to Maranth and Steepley out in Tucson,
Mhm.
the conversations between Oren and the rest of the family, specifically when he calls up Hal, and they talk about what led up to himself's death and afterwards, and how Hal had to reconcile with that. I find those scenes the most interesting, just because I'm finding the most amount of depth, and maybe it's more symbolism in those scenes than in these introspective pieces.
Mhm. Okay. Are you all reading endnotes as you encounter them, or are you?
Yes.
Mhm.
And I'm going to ask, I don't know if I should have read it or not. You haven't referenced it, Stephen, in your own notes yet, that at least not that I've seen. There was somewhere earlier on, there was a reference to note 304, 324, and if I can find it now. Yeah, it is. It's when Struck is plagiarizing the Wheelchair Assassins paper. And I found that one fascinating, but I felt like I read it out of order, I think, so I don't want to
Yeah,
say
if it's 324, we're not that far yet.
304. But the only reason I went to 304 as a footnote is it was referenced in an earlier footnote. It said, yeah, there it was.
The footnotes have footnotes.
Yes.
I know. It's like, so footnote 39, this is
Mhm.
where I found it. Footnote 39, Mraz Sapir, the AFR, leader of the Wheelchair Assassins USA cell, former boyfriend, etc. Then it has footnotes. And one of footnote or endnote 39's footnotes is C note 304. So I went ahead and looked at 304. So I felt like it was doing a choose your own adventure novel, bouncing around a little bit, and read that whole section, which put me a little behind. But and that itself I found fascinating. So I'm lost kind of in the narratives of the endnotes, which themselves are. So I don't know if I know more than I should, except that Wallace pointed me there, so I went.
No, you're fine. That, yeah, like you said, you get a lot on the Wheelchair Assassins in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I will address that in note when it comes up in the text rather than.
In the chronology of the text,
Yeah,
yeah.
because all he's done is cross-referenced in there. It's not really a footnote to that end note. The
Right.
footnotes, end notes are lettered. Like 110 has, footnotes to the end note.
Right, that too.
That's the one with Emily Dickinson.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I think that's so funny, but I do. So,
Well,
so
I
no,
did.
that's good. Yeah, and if um, everything that's in that note will come out later, but it's explained in much greater detail in that note. You're right. Which
Right.
actually that might help you to get to find that thread that you're looking for of plot.
Okay.
Yeah, I find Marath far more accessible now that I know that,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, about him. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's sort of the Trotsky of the Wheelchair Assassins, I think.
There you go.
That's what I would call him.
As long as there's no ice pick appearing, I'm fine. So yeah, so no, and the footnotes, it's funny because again, my girlfriend says, how long do you need to read? I said, well, give me 2 hours on this section. And then she comes back 2 hours later and she says, well, how far are you? I said, I'm getting about 6 pages. She says, how is that possible? I said, I got diverted by these footnotes. I've read a lot, but there's 15 pages of back end of the book. this is how it happens. And then I've reread the film, the note with all the films several times
Mm-hmm.
because that's just a delight. I don't know what to do with some of them, that like untitled, unfinished, unreleased.
That's like the when he's got just blank narration in there, two characters speaking, and you'll just have an ellipsis between quotation marks for
Yeah.
3 or 4 lines. And I know he borrowed that from somebody. I haven't looked up who it was yet, but there's someone who did that first kind of famously. It may have been Nabokov or Pynchon, one of those two that did that. So, and it means something, and I'll draw it out at some point here.
Well, it was done in the first section with Hal, the very first scene in You're Glad. And I just, at that point, I just assumed it was Hal was kind of focusing in and focusing out on the interview. It was only picking up salient points. I'm going to ask if I can, because I keep coming back to it. And I glossed over the first couple of times the title of the book's connection to Shakespeare. Of course, it's there. And you had talked about it as a reference on mortality. But of course, there's at least 5 films also named Infinite Jest. And I've been puzzling over, by Poor York Entertainment Unlimited, I'm not sure what's happening there. I wondered if anyone had any speculation, or if I missed a connection I could have otherwise made.
So, do you see how in the films, the effects that the final Infinite Jest brings about, there's kind of like primitive attempts at them in there.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the sense that I had was that James Incandenza would think, I want to just make a film that's so entertaining that people can't stop watching it. And he didn't have anything nefarious in mind. It was just an artistic challenge for him.
Sure.
Right? So then he makes a film that's kind of along those lines to try it out, a short film. And then, okay, now let me try and make my Infinite Jest film.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I kind of thought is why he kept going back to it. But then there's significance in these numbers, and I have to go back and kind of read through all the notes about it. The number 90 is really significant. The number 5 is significant. Hamlet had 5 soliloquies in the play, so 5 long soliloquies. That would be one possible connection. But I felt like he attempted to make his final film anytime he got close to it, and he couldn't finish them. And then he finally got all the pieces, because as you're going through this, you see these different films. The Medusa film is a piece of it. The film where the audience wants to murder the filmmaker is a piece of it. Those are all like practicing. If it was an artist, you'd call it a sketch of the longer picture. And then he tries to make it, and for one reason or another, he can't. So,
well, I read it. I read those, and as you were saying, and it got me a little nervous because, of course, are we looking at it? I don't know if I should finish the book or not. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, you should
finish the book.
I
understand people read it, then they just cycle back to the beginning, right, Noah?
So that's Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, that works. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'd rather not be
that.
part of it.
That literally is Finnegan's Wake.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's pretty common knowledge. I don't think I'm spoiling that for anybody. So, and who else? Oh, Hemingway did it in For Whom the Bell Tolls also.
Oh, yeah.
The last scene echoed the first scene.
Mm-hmm.
So, well.
I had a professor in college who was supposed to teach us British literature, but 3/4 of the semester was just Joyce. And he was just obsessed with it. It was amazing. I felt fulfilled and cheated at the same time. I'm not sure what I was supposed to do with that. But we walked right up to Finnegan's Wake and didn't touch it. We did Ulysses and then left Finnegan's Wake. So it'll be nice to finally reach that, I hope.
Well, I'm not going anywhere, so you and I can do it if nobody else makes it.
Okay, good. So,
We'll keep going for the rest of our lives. Read books to our graves.
well, that's interesting that you chose this metaphor because, of course, usually at base camp, a good number of people set out, but you abandon them along the way, and usually there's maybe one or two that finally summit at the end. So,
Yeah.
I'm hoping that's not the metaphor that works in this particular way.
If it is, it is. I mean, I've sort of always believed that books came to me at the time when I was ready for them. And they come back to me over and over. That tells me, okay, I'm not ready yet, but the book hasn't given up on me, so I won't give up on it.
Yeah.
And these, I really do think that these are ones that, at least most of them, that people have at one time or another in their lives aspired to read and understand. And they might have thought there was something wrong with them for wanting to do that even. So, if you can make it part, at least I felt that way, but you could make it part of a community endeavor, then you see that, wow, okay, I'm not only not weird, I'm like in a group of pretty bright people that really care deeply about the world and about human beings and about how we can, I love when Jessica says this, live authentically, in that world. So, and so
In good
that's,
faith.
what's that?
In good faith.
Yes, in good faith, exactly. Well, is there anything that you'd like me to do with material-wise to make it easier to process? Is the timing okay? Is the length, the format, and again, the text is really what this is about. If a lot of it is just to have it there so there's something to keep you going if you get completely stuck. But
the timing is keeping me honest, with my reading and holding me to something. I appreciate that it's frequent enough and reliable enough that it's there. I can go to it as a guide, but also it appears at a point to say, okay, yep, and then to kind of kick me back into make sure I find that space in my days to do it.
okay.
So I appreciate that.
Along those same lines, I think the signposts by now, or this lesson is to page such and such. So if that's like right at the beginning, I can always process, okay, so when I'm reading this section, these are the materials that correspond. So that's been really helpful too.
Okay. I won't abandon that.
Yeah, we need signposts.
I do too. I have to remember, is this week 6 or 7? Because I'm trying to get ahead on creating, the final drafts of this stuff, and it's sometimes daunting. So,
I've been on long treks before, and sometimes you run into a guide that will point out where an accident occurred, like a truck went off the road and went into a chasm, or another group hit bad weather and turned back. So I haven't noticed that you have pointed out any danger areas yet. So you're making it seem awfully safe.
it is.
Either I'm in the hands of a really good guide, or you're pulling one off on us at some point. I'm not sure which.
I'm just trying. What I really want is to not, give away too much too soon, because it really is. And you can think real hard about this sentence. This is your choose your own adventure was an interesting thought you had there. This is a book that you have to organize it. Wallace didn't do it for you, and he makes that clear from page 1. All right. And it's not going to be an entertaining thing in the sense of, we get to the end of It's a Wonderful Life. And there's this rock solid, wrapped up conclusion with all the plot threads tied neatly together, and everybody lives happily ever after, right? He didn't set out to write that kind of a book. And so but there's a lot of novels that I find that they start out great and they develop things and they roll along, and then it's like the author got tired and they just said, I'm just going to end this thing. And they contrive it. And I don't have any sense of contrivance from Wallace in this book. You know, it feels like, I mean, if there's a contrivance, he's contriving to conceal from you the things he wants you to work out on your own. That's the only part of it that feels contrived to me.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, we're kind of at a good stopping place. If anybody has any final thought or question, if not, we'll press on in our reading, and I'll press on in my writing and reading, and we'll go from there. And hey, we had no internet crashes today, so
Yeah, it
Yeah.
worked.
everybody say thanks to my friend Stacy.
Make it all work. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we meet back on December 15th, right?
3 weeks from today is
3
that,
weeks.
whatever that date is. Hang on, I've got it. Get my calendar going here. Yeah, I should remind you of that. Thank you, Jessica.
I appreciate the 3-week gap too. I think that's helpful. It's an unexpected choice. Everyone would go, well, bi-weekly or monthly, but I don't think either of those are quite as satisfying. I need enough meat to move forward and enough
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I fully understood that people would fall behind on the reading of this book. I mean, I labored a long time thinking, you know, I could do a whole year just on this book. But then I thought, no, we'd lose everybody if we did that. You know, there has to be. So 14 weeks, that's good to get through it. And if there's parts of it you have to skim over, you skim over it, you pick it up in the discussion of the reading guides, or you mark those pages and go back to them. If there's something that really grabs you, you know, and you want to dig into it, then do that, because like I said, he repeats himself. And the plots they're not mirrors of each other, but they're sort of like, I call them Picasso mirrors of each other, right? You know, he had 6 different people look at the same thing and tell their version of it. So based on their life experience, not based on the events that were happening right in front of them. And that's actually kind of a good way to look at this book. So, okay, well, thank you all. I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving and you're ready for a busy and productive and happy holiday season. So this is fun.
Busy. Got the busy part.
Yep. All right. Well, wish you all the best. If I can do anything at all, I'm available. Get on the Facebook page or email me, or, you know, this is a thrill for me. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Steve.
you, Stephen.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.